This podcast is produced by the Center for Deployment Psychology at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. The views expressed are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Uniformed Services University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. In addition, references to any specific companies, products, processes, or services does not necessarily constitute or imply endorsement by the Uniformed Services University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Welcome to CDP's podcast, Practical for Your Practice,
where we give you actionable intel to support what you do.
One colleague to another.
Well, welcome to Practical for Your Practice, CDP's podcast about evidence-based psychotherapies. I'm Dr. Kevin Holloway. I'm here as usual with Jenna Ermold and Andy Santinello. You guys want to say hi?
Hi.
Hello.
And joining us today is a good friend of mine for many years, Dr. Michael Jones. Actually, he's was with CDP not so long ago. But he's moved on to other interesting things. Michael, tell us about yourself, what you're doing.
Hey, everyone. Yeah. So if you're a big fan of CDP and spend all of your time following them, you may have seen me, and I do make a few appearances in a few sleep videos as well.
That's right.
I'm the guy with the butt chin and the receding hairline. So my name is Mike Jones. I'm a psychologist. I currently work as a contractor with the Army, and of course everything that I say is my own opinion. But I joined the Air Force shortly after September 11th, and actually Dr. Ermold was one of my first supervisors.
Best intern ever.
And definitely the best supervisor ever. And so anything I say is probably because she corrected me early on in my career. But I felt kind of like a patriotic draw when after September 11th. I was a PhD student when that all happened. I had an uncle who had been a fighter pilot, flew F-15s. And so growing up, I had a lot of exposure to the military and was always drawn to that. And then while I was an undergrad and a grad student, I worked quite a bit with local law enforcement, and just I've always felt a connection to kind of the first responder military type of people, because they have a unique set of stresses that they go through. And that goes way back to when I was an undergrad student, and really felt a passion for working with that type of population. So joined the Air Force, had a great time, active duty, and too many stories, too many good things to talk about when it comes to that. But I got to do a deployment to Afghanistan during that time. I became a reservist, meaning that weekend warrior where you do 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year with occasional deployments. After I finished my 4 years of active duty, like I mentioned, I did a deployment where I got to fly all over Afghanistan and really see some of the stresses that our soldiers, sailors, Marine and airmen are faced with when they're in a combat zone. And one of the highlights of my career actually was to do that. Came back and I spent probably close to a decade working in a programs and research service where we did a lot of research on military and service members and how to maximize benefits for treatment. Following that, I did a couple little stints where I was again, all of this is a civilian working for particular Army units. And as was mentioned, I did a stint working for CDP as at one of the Army internship sites. And in fact, during my whole time working as an Army civilian, I've almost always taught a couple of classes or been on faculty at the internship sites, teaching young baby Army psychologists. It's a passion I have for teaching. Later, I transferred to the Army Reserves, and I've done another deployment to the Middle East since then. And so I've been able to see the way that the military has changed, and the nature of deployments have changed from the early 2000s to the late 2000s. And presently, I work as a psychologist within an Army unit, and so day to day, I'm getting questions and dealing with the long aftermath and even the ongoing kind of struggles that people have with their military service. And then dialing back even further, Dr. Holloway and I went to a program together for our PhD program that had a strong focus on psychotherapy research, but in a little bit of an unusual way, because most psychotherapy research that you all hear about is empirically supported treatments. So a specific treatment for a specific diagnosis, such as cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. But there is a branch of psychotherapy research that's focused on general factors. And so I've been exposed to that all the way back in grad school. And I think that's what we'll talk about today.
Yeah.
There's my long story.
Well, and such relevant experience. I think it's really cool for people to hear that, because you got a long experience working with the types of people, with the types of populations that a lot of people who I think listen to this podcast have, but also relevant, from the teaching side of things for EBPs and for psychotherapy in general. It's one of the reasons we really wanted to invite you to participate in the conversation today. Just to orient our listeners, one of the things, that we like to do in the podcast is think about like questions that people ask us during workshops and kind of the issues that they'll bring up. And I think one that I've heard a lot, and perhaps you all have heard too, is as we're talking about, as we're teaching a protocol, for example, for, specific treatment for a specific disorder, the question comes up quite a bit of like, well, how do common factors fit into this? And I think it's a really important question for us to talk about, is psychotherapy nothing more than a checklist that we run down and check all the boxes, or like, where do these other things fit in? So I don't know, as we're kind of getting started with that, let's maybe kind of orient people into what we're talking about when we mean common factors. Like, what common factors are we even, referring to?
What are these common factors?
That's a great question.
And how common are they? Right.
Yeah. It's like common sense, right?
Well, and I'll tell you, I think when people ask that question, the one that immediately comes to mind is therapeutic alliance, right? That relationship and the importance of that relationship. And I think that's an important piece of this. So maybe we can start there.
Yeah. So, and maybe I'll run through a lot of the common factors are stuff that are alliance based, and things such as, having accurate empathy that the therapist is able to communicate an understanding, and that the client can feel that from them. Alliance, and that sometimes gets into things such as collaboration and consensus, that both people feel like they're working toward a common goal, and that's part of that alliance. And then some of the traditional Rogerian types of stuff, such as that positive regard, that affirmation, that the therapist communicating that you are a good human who is trying their best. Congruence and genuineness. When the therapist makes a statement or makes a comment, that it feels genuine and not faked.
Mm-hmm.
So those are generally what are thought of as the common factors.
So related to that, I think that the sense that I get sometimes when people ask us is that I was always taught, for example, I'm maybe speaking in their voice, I was always taught that common factors pretty much account for all of the change that we see in psychotherapy. And so if we focus on common factors, then we don't need all this other stuff. Why do we even need CBT for insomnia, for example? Why do we need ACT? Why do we need any of these protocols or these approaches if we've got common factors on board?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And I if I can pull a CBT term, I think that maybe sometimes displays our tendency for black and white thinking, that it must be one or the other, that we cannot have, that somehow common factors do not coexist with specific treatments. And I think that often So, I mean, if you go back into the origin of the common factors research, and this goes back like to the 1930s, but basically they were starting to do review articles that were comparing treatments head to head, and they were starting to see that a lot of these treatments kind of had equal success. So if you were looking at some of the focused interpersonal treatments or a brief dynamic treatment, that they were having, close to equivalent success as other treatments. And that's really what prompted the, often the joke is the Dodo bird verdict, which is the scene from Alice in Wonderland, where the Dodo bird proposes a race and they all run around in a circle until they get dry. And then they're like, well, who won? And the Dodo bird says, everybody won, and everyone must have prizes. It's a famous paper in psychotherapy research. But it prompted this idea of like, well, if we are seeing a lot of overlap in success between the different treatments, why is that? And I think that's actually what prompted the common factors research. But I think if it's like, hey, common factors account for a large proportion of the change, I think that's maybe. I think sometimes Dr. Holloway. I think what I see is two pieces. One is people think all common factors is like empathy. It's just the hey, how are you doing? I always joke it's the huggy
warm
psychotherapy
stuff, right?
Yeah. And I think, if you really dig into what is alliance and what is this idea of goal, consensus, and collaboration, I think that's maybe where people aren't necessarily thinking about that when they talk about common factors, and how having a goal can really is part of the common factors. And so working with people toward a specific outcome, such as reducing insomnia or reducing the number of nightmares, like that is part that has been kind of subsumed into the common factors research as well.
Well, and I think sometimes the fear, maybe the question comes from fear that I'm going to have to give up these great things that I know work with lots of my clients if I take on this sort of more rigid protocol that's an EBP, instead of seeing the EBP as the structure, sort of the scaffolding to hang these other, the common factors on. Like you can't do one without the other, and you have to have balance between the two and see the similarities. And so that's almost where I sometimes feel like the question comes from, like, but wait, isn't this all this other stuff? And how do I keep that and do this protocol? And what's your experience with that?
Yeah. And I think that we're kind of like getting to the end of the podcast right at the beginning, but I do think that is, for me, that's what the answer has been. Like if I see someone, back when I was training students, if I see a student going in there and they're cold and robotic and they're like reading out of the manual, and I did the same thing. Dr. Irmo probably remembers me doing the same thing.
No comment. You're always warm and approachable. I don't know what you're talking about. And it's okay that we can go by first names on this podcast. Okay. We're really relaxed.
Sorry, I don't want to take away from your all of your training and status that you have.
Remember, I told you always call me Dr. Irmo.
always, it stuck with me. Yeah, so I think that's often where I go. And if I'm seeing that student who is jumping in there and they're reading that script and they're very diligent, they're trying to go through, okay, session one is this. So session one of prolonged exposure is taking a detailed trauma history, and they're going
always
through
earnest, right? That's earnest.
Yeah. Exactly. But that earnestness sometimes becomes throwing the baby out with the bathwater. They're so focused on the rigid technical aspects that they forget that this is a human endeavor. Like this is an interpersonal process that we're going through, and there's a reason that people work with a therapist and a counselor. It is a human interaction, and there's power in it. There's power in that interpersonal interaction, to the point of if they don't feel that affirmation, that alliance, and that positive regard, it really doesn't matter how skillful your exposure treatment is if they don't feel like you understand and can communicate an accurate empathy of how it is. So I always come off the top rope when I see a student robotic because because yelling at someone to be more warm is always the right way to go.
That's one of the challenging aspects of it, as I'm thinking about these common factors and, being a human with another human in the room is that sense of vulnerability. We talk about common factors as this variable that's important to pay attention to, and we kind of gloss over it, but it's also a little bit fuzzy, and it has a lot to do with this. I mean, you have to be vulnerable as a therapist. You got to be a human being in the room with that other human being. And as we're kind of talking about sticking to the protocol and focusing on technique and being in that role of expert, I think there is kind of that danger that the more expertise you have, or the more you're trying to stick with the protocol. And we've been talking about trainees, but I mean, this also happens with seasoned professionals too.
Mm-hmm.
You can almost double down on if you notice there's sort of something with the alliance, you can sort of double down on, well, I got to be even more technically correct and follow the protocol better, which actually maybe makes that connection worse. So I guess that's something just to sort of notice. There's a lot to track when you're doing EBP. And one of the things to track is the quality of your connection with the client.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a great story for this. I was working with a combat veteran who had some pretty substantial PTSD. He was brought to me because he had become pretty intoxicated one evening and had started to say things that really worried his buddies, and he kind of came to me unwillingly, was kind of forced in that way. And I was a very young and dumb kind of therapist. I'm like, all right, PTSD, we're going to do exposure treatment, because I do believe in the power of exposure treatments for PTSD, even as someone who deeply believes in the power of common factors. So I jumped in with exposure treatment, and we were kind of going along, and like nothing's happening. And it took me probably toward the end of the session, and I'm like, hey man, like we're not seem to be connecting on this. And then he said, well, my dad was a psychologist. And my jaw dropped, and I just had a human moment where I laughed, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, man. I can't even imagine what my kids are going to have to go through. My kids were pretty little at that point. And then he laughed, and it really was this kind of human connection moment, and where I had empathy, right? Like I saw that he was, in that moment, I caught on that he was very wary of me, probably related to, some stuff with how he grew up, and having a dad that was always in his business, just like I'm in my kid's business. And so I kind of laughed and said, yeah, I'm sorry about that. That sounds awful. And then he laughed, and we connected, and we actually had a very, very great working relationship out of that. And we're able to do some successful exposure types of treatment that I don't think would have happened without me having that kind of working on the empathy and that positive regard and affirmation.
Well, and I think just I love that example, and in that moment how you are spontaneously human, and I think that's also one of the challenges I think in training clinicians and working on becoming, working on the common factors, is a lot of it has to do with those spontaneous moments. How do you train spontaneity, without it seeming really stilted, right?
How do you manualize spontaneity?
Yeah, what's the checklist?
I haven't read that research yet. I'm not sure.
You should write that up.
It's all you, Andy. You have your marching orders.
Yeah, no interest in that. It's just one of those things that's, I think, tricky. And one of the reasons that common factors just sort of gets put in this box of, yeah, this is important. Therapists need to have that. Accounts for a lot of the variance, but make sure you do that. We're just going to assume you've got it, but getting into the nitty gritty of what actually happened in that moment that you talked about, it's harder. I don't know if our models that we work from really give us a way of adequately sort of talking about that and conceptualizing it in a way that doesn't reduce it down to rules to follow or steps that you have to, go through every time.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know Kevin and I, we went to a program that was kind of like Yugoslavia, right? It was like every different professor had a very, very strong feeling about what therapy should look like. So we had like a no kidding David Burns trained CBT professor, and we had like third generation Rogerian trained person. And we had like interpersonal individuals, and we had psychodynamic professors and one or two that were very well known group therapy researchers as well. And like I feel pretty lucky that I had that experience, because I think back to one of my professors, Kevin, you might remember this story. She was a psychodynamic and group therapist, and she was showing videos of her doing group therapy. And in this group therapy moment, her stomach grumbled, and she one of the group participants tried to be motherly, to kind of jump into a little bit of psychodynamics, which was her style. And she said, "Oh, are you hungry?" And she said, "No, I'm nervous. I really want to be able to make this point right now, and this is a tense situation." And so to have some of that, have a little bit of the interpersonal and dynamic training, I think that often they had a little more of that language for how to work through and understand your own feelings as you were doing therapy. To me, has been really valuable. And like I had a guy come in just 2 days ago who I've known him for about 4 years, ever since I started working in this particular place. And he's kind of having the start of some panic attacks in a certain training situation, starting to hyperventilate, feel kind of the constriction and everything, and probably not quite diagnostic, but certainly prodromal. And that's the right word for panic attacks. And he and I had we have a long history together. And so we went right to developing an exposure hierarchy. So like I'm all about exposure treatments. And we went through and we found like, hey, here's the worst. Here's a 0. There's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And like, okay, hey, we're at a 5. And for you, you're gonna put on your helmet and your flak vest, and you're gonna go run out in the heat. And that's going to recreate this pressure sensation for you in a way that you can desensitize, but without like the consequences of an 8 or 9, right? So that's standard like panic treatment. And I didn't even have any kind of alliance because it was already there. But I think if you ignore, if you're not making sure that the alliance is primary, that can go really south.
I think that's going back to something that came up earlier. I think that's, one of the things that people get concerned about when they come to an EBP workshop or consider implementing EBPs in their practice. There's that fear of, I have to put down everything that I've developed or learned before, right? I have to switch gears and do something different. And that's not necessarily the case. You build, kind of these protocols, if you will, or, on top of the processes that are there already, or that work to be human and to have that real interaction with the person. And then you build on top of that by helping them perhaps engage in, kind of behaviors or the work that you would do to address some of their particular issues, but, not getting rid of what you've developed in the past, something that's, really valuable, you're adding to it.
Yeah, right. There's that fear, like, oh, well, if it's all common factors, all I have to do is when this guy walks in, say, "Oh, that sounds," yeah. I'm like, I'm creating a straw man of what common factors are, but that sounds really rough and horrible, and that's going to have the same outcome. And I will say that even within the common factors research, there is room. Like some of the more advanced research shows that there are some treatment differences, and some of the treatment differences become pretty pronounced when you're talking about the anxiety disorders too. So I think, and I remember, Kevin, our professor saying, like, hey, if you're not doing exposure treatment for panic disorder, you're probably in the wrong. And that's from a true blue Rogerian therapist. So yeah, I think so.
I think the opposite is also something that people get concerned about too. Like they feel like, therapeutic alliance and other common factors are so important and so essential to the process that they need to spend months and months and months and months building up alliance before we do anything else.
I was actually gonna say Michael worked in primary care, and I was gonna harken back to that experience, similar to what you're saying, Kevin. That's a setting where you got to jump in fast, right? You don't have time, and you have to figure out ways to build alliance super quickly. And I think, given what Kevin's saying, that's a mistake. Lots of people want to spend all this time building up this therapeutic alliance. Comment on that, your experience in. Is that necessary, or how can you do that in a setting like primary care, or sort of quickly when you have to be able to get that engagement and move on to, kind of the shared goals and the treatment planning and what you're doing?
Yeah. I hadn't even added that. I was complimenting like my, all the different professors I had, but primary care work is an excellent example of that. And I still remember the script that that Jenna taught me, snapshot. She said, there's one word you must say, and it's snapshot.
What's going well, what's not going so well.
That's right. And you would develop a little bit of a script, and if you're watching to see if you have that, if you're able to engage with them quickly and develop that consensus and collaboration. Remember, common factors are not just about the warm, fuzzy feelings. It's about people getting on board with the program, and they feeling like they trust you and that you are understanding them. And if you can develop that quickly, especially for very focused problems, you can get going rapidly. I remember Kevin and I, we were in school. We had a brief psychotherapy expert come and speak with us, and he had a practice, and they'd done some research on it. And I remember one of the comments from the research team was like, "This dude is really good." I don't think they said dude because I'm the California guy, but they said, this professor, this doctor is really, really good at rapidly developing the relationship with people.
I think that's a really important point, that this isn't like now we're going to develop the relationship, now we're going to do a protocol kind of a thing. Like this is all happening at the same time. And those, you've referenced this a couple of times, but common factors isn't just that warm, fuzzy feeling, or it's not just that, the unconditional positive regard. It's one of them, right? But even the idea of having, like you said, setting goals or having realistic expectations for outcome, or, talking about, even some psychoeducation around what they're experiencing, all of that stuff can be part of building the alliance too, and having that real human interaction, that real human relationship and connection while doing those things all contribute to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's lots of ways to do that. And there's some really good books out there, like Heart and Soul Change is a Lambert book. I'm trying to remember the one by Scott Miller that also talks about it. And I've gone and done some therapy myself. And I remember one particular session where the doc, I didn't feel was kind of hearing me very well. I felt like she kind of had her own agenda of what she believed I should think and feel. And I was being a nice guy because it's what I do. And I didn't say anything. And at the end, she gave me an outcome measure. And I think it's the Scott Miller one. It's like the 4-item outcome measure. And one of the questions was, do you feel like the therapist understood you today? And I put no. And we had a conversation about it. That's that was her taking care of ensuring that the common factors were present with me, even though she had a very specific treatment model that she was working on.
And that's kind of the second example of almost when, and I don't mean a mistake, but, that story you told earlier about you kind of looking up and saying like, hey man, this doesn't seem like it's working. And I think that's another, going back to what Andy said about vulnerability, when things aren't going well, when you're not clicking, and if you don't stop in that moment and try to address it, and that's almost what moves that alliance up even faster versus just kind of like pushing on with the protocol or pushing on with the next objective.
Won't the protocol police come and haul you away?
Yes.
No, I mean, it's a really good point of knowing when to really attend to the relationship and Andy has referred to alliance ruptures before. Like, they attend to those things as they come up and recognize when it's okay to kind of pause whatever protocol or whatever, checklist thing you were going to work through that day and really attend to that person in the room, that human in the room.
Yeah.
It reminds me a lot of a conversation we had with Dr. Robin Walser in a previous episode, talking about processes versus protocols, the importance of focusing on the processes, and those relationship pieces are part of those. I can't remember the term she used. Andy, do you remember this? It was like these little slices of behavior, or these, that are all part of what's going on in that room that we need to be attending to, and not just are we checking the boxes in the right order, and are the protocol police going to come take us away, that kind of thing. So given all of that, Michael, and we appreciate you being here talking about this stuff with us. This is Practical for Your Practice. We like to end any of our episodes with some actionable intel, things that practical tips that our listeners can take with them and implement today regarding these things. So with regards to common factors and how that interweaves with EBPs, any thoughts about that? Any tips for?
Yeah. I've got a couple. I wish I remember the name of the person that said this. He was a World War I corpsman, and he said, counting is an antidote to bias. And we fall in love with our treatment. We think we're doing great, which is where you want to think that you want to feel like you're competent. But counting is a way to kind of understand where you're at. And so triple stomp the idea of doing some kind of outcome measure. And it's funny, that's some of the research what I did my dissertation on was outcome measures at the end of therapy. And so I always believed in it. I saw the research that when you have the patient fill out measures of alliance, such as the outcome questionnaire, or measures of their status, and you see if they are getting improvement, getting better or worse, and you can talk to them about that. Hey, it looks like you're actually feeling better, like your symptoms seem to be going down. Like that's a way to demonstrate empathy and that you're working together. Or if you're using some of the Miller kinds of post-therapy assessments, just 4 questions. Those are great ways to, and I guess we'll link to them. Those are great ways to double check, and that counting really can work quite well. The other thing that I love is kind of the Prochaska Di Clemente trans-theoretical model of readiness for change, and for a while it was kind of in vogue to add that to your treatment planning, to consider, hey, where is this person in their readiness for change? Are they pre-contemplative? Are they like not even in a place where they think they should change? Or are they kind of contemplating it, but not really ready to pull the trigger? Or are they in that, contemplation and action or maintenance mode? So adding a little bit of a consideration about where the person is, I think is all can be kind of subsumed in this idea of developing an alliance and being able to be empathetic. Is that kind of what you're asking for?
Thank you. I think that's fantastic. Those are some great tips and suggestions for folks. Really appreciate you having on. It's always a good time talking with you and kind of both reminiscing, but also, really kind of taking on some of these topics and wrestling with them a bit. So.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Anytime to tell a few stories and get a few laughs, and I'm happy to do that.
It was really good to have you on today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Practical for Your Practice.
Please feel free to subscribe, rate, and join in on the conversation in the comments.
Until next time.